This is hands down one of the craziest stories I remember from my criminal psychology class, and I'm still baffled by it every time I think about it. There was this woman who was in a long-term relationship about to marry this guy. Seemed like a normal couple, right? But what nobody knew was that she had a very strange kink. And by strange, I mean really out there. She had this obsession with what could only be described as a rape kink. But here's the thing, this wasn't the consensual roleplay type of kink we're familiar with, no. This woman wanted the illusion of being raped, but in a way that felt disturbingly real. It wasn't just about power dynamics or control. No, she needed to feel like she was actually the victim of something violent, traumatic, and uncontrollable. She wasn't just into pretending. She wanted to feel the fear, the panic, the rawness of the experience. And she was so committed to this desire that she went to extreme lengths to make it happen. So, this woman came up with a bizarre plan. She hired a man, someone she didn't know, to break into her house while her fiancé was away and essentially rape her. The guy was just a hired actor in this twisted performance. She'd set it all up. The fake break-in, the fake violence, the fake screams. She planned the whole thing out like some sort of sick script. She figured that if her fiancé came home to find her like that, naked, bruised, terrified, he'd believe it was a real assault. She wasn't just acting it out, though. She needed him to believe it. She wanted the entire experience to feel real. So, when the fiancé was out, she'd let the man in. He wasn't there to hurt her. Not really, but she wanted him to make it look like a violent attack. They staged the whole thing. She screamed, she struggled, and he pretended to overpower her. The whole situation was set up to feel as real as possible, and when the fiancé arrived home that night, he found exactly what his fiancée had planned. Her body was covered in bruises. She was naked and chained to the bed, just as she had set it up. The fiancé, completely shocked and confused, rushed to her side, not knowing what had just happened. She was crying, desperately saying that someone had broken in and tried to assault her. She had planned for this, knowing the fiancé would believe it. He was terrified, of course, but everything she had told him, everything she had orchestrated, seemed to confirm it. She played the victim perfectly. Her cries were loud enough to be believable, and when the fiancé rushed to her side, his mind was racing. He didn't know what had happened, but everything seemed to match up. His fiancée was in danger. Someone had broken in and assaulted her. It was the worst-case scenario, and his first instinct was to protect her, to save her from whatever had happened. The problem, though, was that it wasn't real. It was all staged, all a part of the sick fantasy she had cooked up. And yet, for a while, her fiancé believed it. In his panic and concern, he didn't have the clarity to question it. He wasn't thinking about anything other than getting her help, protecting her from whoever had hurt her. But deep down, something didn't sit right with him. There were too many inconsistencies in the scene. The way she had reacted, the way she had been positioned in the bed, the lack of any real injury. But at that moment, everything was clouded by fear and confusion. He didn't want to believe that the woman he loved could have set this up, that this was all some twisted plan for her own sick pleasure. And so, he took care of her, reassured her, and did what anyone in his position would do. He called the authorities. But what happened next was nothing short of unexpected. So, after the whole mess unfolded, you'd think that things would have calmed down a bit. But no, the real chaos was just beginning. The fiancée tried to salvage whatever dignity she had left, and as expected, she started spinning this whole new story. When the cops arrived, and they started asking her questions about what had actually happened, she decided to come clean, sort of. She tried to tell them the truth, but her version of the truth was something straight out of a twisted movie. I was just trying to make it seem like I was really attacked, she confessed, as if that made any sense. It was consensual. Everything we did was just to make it look like he'd assaulted me. I just wanted him to believe it. Yeah, that's right. She told the cops that it was all part of some messed up performance, and she expected them to just go along with it. She even asked them to pretend like they were opening an investigation, as if they were just going to go along with her weird fantasy. She thought they would play along and not tell the fiancé what had really happened, that they'd let her get away with it. But the police weren't having it. They didn't buy her story for a second. They saw through the facade. It was like they could read between the lines and understand the manipulation happening in front of them. There was no pretending here. No one was going to be let off the hook, especially not her. The reality was too clear. The cops immediately informed the fiancé. They told him everything. They explained what had really happened, that it wasn't an assault, that she wasn't a... How would you feel if your partner hid their affair for months or even years? Write in the comments, victim, and that it had all been her plan. They told him that she had hired the guy, that this wasn't some twisted accident, but a deliberate act, something she had set in motion. The fiancé didn't know how to respond at first. He was in complete shock, just trying to make sense of the insanity of it all. But when he finally processed it, the anger started to boil over. How could she do this to him? He was devastated, not just by the betrayal, but by the sheer audacity she had shown. To think that she could pull something like this off and expect to get away with it was beyond him. And then, she went even further. When confronted, she insisted that nothing had happened between her and the guy. We didn't have sex, she said. We just did enough to make it look real, but nothing happened. I didn't want to actually be assaulted. I couldn't believe it when I heard that. She actually tried to downplay it, to reduce everything she had done to just a bizarre performance for her own twisted gratification. She was trying to act as though this was some harmless roleplay that had gotten a little out of hand. But there was no mistaking the truth now. The fiancé knew what she had done, and so did everyone else. I think the hardest part for the fiancé wasn't just finding out that his fiancée had lied to him. It was the fact that she had tried to manipulate him into believing that this was something he should just brush off. She thought she could control the situation, make it look like he was in the wrong for not being there for her, for not fulfilling her needs. But that wasn't what happened at all. She had lied. She had manipulated him. She had used the police to cover up her actions and tried to make him believe she was the victim in all of this. But by the time the truth came out, there was no going back. The fiancé couldn't look at her the same way anymore. How could he? She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She had taken things too far, and now everything had fallen apart. At that moment, he made a decision. He couldn't stay with her, couldn't live in the lie anymore. He walked away, and she was left there, staring at the wreckage of everything she had built with him. She had destroyed their relationship, and no amount of excuses or apologies could change that. What I didn't expect was that, even after all of this, she didn't stop trying to manipulate the situation. She kept insisting that she hadn't done anything wrong, that everything was just a misunderstanding. But the fiancé wasn't having it. He couldn't pretend that this was just some harmless fantasy. He couldn't go back to someone who had betrayed him in such a cruel way. It was over. And while it didn't happen overnight, the decision was final. There was no room for a relationship built on lies, no space for someone who thought they could control everything, even at the expense of the truth. For me, looking back on it, it's hard to believe the audacity she had. To go that far, to create such an elaborate lie, and to think that she could get away with it. But the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how hard you try to bury it. And in the end, that was what tore everything down. The lies, the manipulation, the attempt to control a situation that was already out of control. And as for the fiancé, well, it was heartbreaking, no doubt. He had loved her, trusted her, and built his life with her. But now, he was left to pick up the pieces of a relationship destroyed by deceit. So here's the kicker. As crazy as all this sounds, the twist was even more wild than I could have imagined. After everything came out, it wasn't just the cheating that had messed with my mind. It was the whole underlying thing about her. I couldn't shake the feeling that her actions were more than just about getting off. No, it was something deeper, something that was part of who she was. Turns out, the whole rape kink thing wasn't even her primary issue. Yeah, that's right. Her kink wasn't exactly about rape itself, but more about the feeling of being a victim to something horrendous. It wasn't about power dynamics or typical roleplay. It was about her need to feel like she was the victim of something truly traumatizing. She craved that sense of vulnerability, the emotional wreckage that came with being forced into a horrific situation. It wasn't about consent or control. It was about the pure psychological aftermath of feeling victimized. At first, I thought she just liked playing these twisted little games, but soon, I started to see this as part of a much bigger, deeply ingrained pattern of behavior. I learned that this wasn't her first time manipulating a situation for the sake of some emotional drama. Oh no, this woman had a history of doing this kind of stuff. She had a whole list of fabricated trauma stories that she would tell people just to make herself seem like this tragic, tortured soul. It wasn't enough to be loved or respected. She wanted to be seen as a survivor of something beyond what normal people could imagine. One of the things she had told her fiancé was that she had childhood cancer. Yeah, you read that right. She spun this elaborate tale about how she had battled a horrible illness as a child, and it was the defining moment of her life. She made it sound so convincing that he believed every word of it. But guess what? There was no cancer. She had never had it. It was all a story she had created to gain sympathy, to manipulate him into believing that she was somehow special, someone who had survived a battle that no one else could understand. And it wasn't just the cancer story. No, she took it further. She told him that her friend had been brutally murdered right in front of her. She said she had witnessed the murder firsthand, and that it had completely shattered her. I mean, what kind of person goes around telling people these things? What kind of sick person fabricates traumatic events like this just to get attention and validation? And the worst part? He believed her. He bought into it. And I don't know if that makes him a fool, or if it just makes her an incredibly skilled manipulator. But wait, there's more. She had even convinced him that her parents had abused her growing up. She told him that she had been through unspeakable abuse as a child, and that it had left scars that no one could ever heal. Again, none of it was true. It was just another piece of her carefully constructed backstory, designed to make her seem like someone who had been through the worst, who had faced unimaginable pain, and who needed someone to save her. I started to realize that these weren't just isolated incidents. This was who she was. She had built a life of lies, of pretending to be the tragic heroine in a story that wasn't hers. She needed to be the victim in everything, even when there was no real reason for it. The rape kink was just a symptom of a much deeper problem. She needed to feel like she was the center of everyone's attention, the one who had suffered the most. And to get that, she was willing to lie, manipulate, and destroy the lives of the people around her. When I put all of this together, I couldn't help but feel disgusted. This wasn't just a case of a woman who had made a mistake or who had some weird fetish. This was someone who had been living in a world of lies, who had used people's emotions as her playground. She was a master manipulator, and the worst part was that she had dragged me, her fiancé, and others into her twisted little world. But of course, the manipulation didn't stop there. When the truth finally came out, when everything was laid bare, She did what every manipulator does best. She tried to make herself the victim once again. She told people that she had never really had sex with the guy, that everything was staged, that it was all a setup to make it look like she had been assaulted. It was all part of the game, she said. The police weren't going to buy it. Her fiancé wasn't going to buy it. No one was going to buy it. But somehow, she still tried to play the victim card one last time. In the end, it wasn't just the betrayal that messed me up. It was the realization that she had been living in this bizarre world of make-believe, creating trauma after trauma to gain sympathy and attention. And I wasn't the only one who was caught in her web. Her fiancé, the people around her, and even her own family had been manipulated by her for years. I learned one of the hardest lessons I've ever had to learn, that sometimes people don't just hurt you physically. They can tear you apart emotionally, mentally, and psychologically. And in the end, you have to walk away from the toxicity they create, no matter how difficult it is. As for her, well, the fallout was inevitable. The lies were exposed, and her manipulative games were over. She had nothing left to hide behind. The facade crumbled, and what was left was the wreckage of her own creation. As for me, I'm better off without her, without all the lies, the manipulation, and the emotional destruction. It's been a long road to recovery, but I've learned the value of honesty, trust, and self-worth.